Hey all, this is James from TeaDB, bringing you another deep dive into a tea-related topic. So for today, this episode we will not be tasting anything again, but we'll be focusing on pouring time with a few different devices that I regularly use for tea. So I filmed, I think I measured the pour time for probably around 8 or 9 different vessels that I'll use now and then. About a month ago, I filmed an episode on heat retention, so if you haven't checked that out, please do check that out. Got some very good and positive feedback for that, so thank you for those who commented. Again, for this episode, it's kind of an atypical thing, so feedback, really appreciated. If there is some other topic that you think I could approach in a similar fashion, really open to suggestions. If you didn't care for the episode, that's okay. Please comment, let me know. And so I said in a similar thing that we often take basic things like heat and pouring time for granted, and we don't really think about them too much, mainly sort of relying on our intuition. But I think these are really important aspects of making tea, and they have a really large impact. In this episode, I wanted to go a little bit beyond that intuitive approach, take some measurements, do a few experiments, do some trials, just like we're in high school or college lab class, and see what we find. So this is an area where, in my opinion, the difference of 5 or 10 seconds of pour time may not seem like a whole lot. But when you are brewing similar to how Denny or myself brew on the show, for instance, if we're brewing a young sheng pu'er, 5 to 10 seconds can be an awfully big difference when we're essentially giving it a flash steep. For instance, this blue pot that I use for brewing ripe in the morning, brewed on average between 15 to 17 seconds, depending on how you measured it. This means even if you pour the pot immediately after I pour water in from my kettle, that we're essentially letting the tea steep for a while. So that's very different than if we had something like this gaiwan, which can pour in under 5 seconds going. So your flash steeps just would look dramatically different, and it's the reason why we need to alter leaf to water ratio and think about things like that when we're considering the tea and what vessel to use. It might not be a good idea to brew something like young pu'er in this at the same ratio that you would use for a much smaller, faster pouring device, right? I wanted to do a quick overview and lay out a few ground rules. So I measured pour time both with the empty vessel, so a vessel with no tea in it at all, and then a vessel, again, with tea. So the vessel is obviously a pretty important, probably the most important aspect for pour time, but there's a subtle but significant difference in how brewing with tea versus without tea impacts things, and it impacts pots and things like gaiwans differently. So we'll discuss that in a little bit. And I completed the episode with comparison of pouring from the kettle with the left hand versus the right hand, and if that makes a difference, how big is that difference, etc. The first ground rule is when brewing with the tea, there's oftentimes a slow trickle at the end, and so when you're watching an episode, you'll sometimes see Denny or I go like, trying to get everything out of that. I did not include that sort of slow trickle time out at the end in the measurements. So I Georged it just off of the regular brew, and it's not exactly a precise science, but I think that's probably the more honest way towards the actual practicalities and effectiveness of brewing, rather than like trying to count how long it takes for you to shake out every single last drop. So one thing I was forced to thinking about was sort of the control over pouring speed. So when you pour with a pot, barring no clogs, you'll see that there's sort of a limited amount of liquid that can come out of it. So you really don't have a ton of control over the speed, barring clogs again. And gaiwans and gaiwan-like devices, such as the Shibo that I sometimes use, are different. they have what I have been thinking of as a controllable pour. You could control sort of like the gap here, and you could pour very fast, or you could make the gap really small and pour more slowly. So to cover this in a way that I think makes sense, I poured as quickly as I possibly could, and I also did another trial pouring as slowly as I could within a reasonable fashion. So I did 3 trials of each one, and found the results to be fairly similar across the board, but I wanted to make sure that I had enough sort of trials and errors to make sure that everything turned out in a way that I believe is accurate. And thankfully, unlike the heat retention episode, we are not operating in temperature where we have different scales. In the US, we use our antiquated scale Fahrenheit, which I'm just frankly more familiar in thinking about, which is why I used it in the last episode. So sorry to the non-Americans out there who I know have all come to Celsius, but time measurement thankfully is fairly universal, so we will be using seconds. As we talked about, gaiwans and shibos have a controllable pour. So in this initial experiment, I poured as fast as I could, and so in general, I found that gaiwans, this is about 120, this is about a 75. They pour very fast regardless of the size, at least within my range. So you have the option to pour them very quickly. So in my experiment, I found that the shibo poured the fastest, around 2.4 seconds, and this gaiwan poured a little bit slower, around 3. Again, that in the context of the graded results, that's all really quite fast. Now, you can, of course, pour slower if you'd like. Pouring slowly, but within reason, is a pretty subjective measurement. But you can see that under these measurements, these same devices measured, quite a bit slower, 10 seconds, depending on how you're pouring. So it makes a big difference if someone is going tentatively, maybe because the gaiwan is really filled up, or if they're going fast and very confidently. And so I think there's kind of a hidden advantage to the gaiwan that we don't really talk about too much, the controllable pour. And so you really do have control over whether you can pour extremely fast or slowly if you choose, whereas you don't necessarily have that same flexibility when you are brewing with an actual teapot. So this is probably something that's really pretty insignificant if you're talking about steeping the tea for over a minute. But as I've mentioned before, in a lot of the gongfu tea, we're steeping this tea for sometimes under 10 seconds. So things like 5 seconds, 10 seconds, that can be really quite a large amount of time in the context. Looking at gaiwans and shibos with tea. So I had a couple ideas coming into this, like what impact would the tea have to the overall pour time. So I had a couple ideas. On one hand, you might expect it to speed up the pour because the leaves take up volume in sort of the body of your gaiwan, so you're essentially pouring less liquid out of them. On the other hand, you also have things that are sort of infringing on the pour and sort of getting in the way, so the pour might be slower. So you could make a case either way, depending on what factor you'd think would have the larger impact. So for these experiments, I poured as quickly as possible. So really, we're comparing this with the pouring fast with an empty vessel. So we can see for both the gaiwans and the shibo I measured with that they actually poured more slowly with tea, approximately 2.5 seconds in just about every case. So that is not a huge amount of time, but it does also approximately double the measured pour time. So the practical pour time isn't really 2.5 to 3 seconds. It's closer to 5 seconds when you're pouring. So, it's a small amount of time. We're talking just single-digit seconds here. But is it an insignificant amount of time? I would not go so far to say that either. It shows that, even though there is less water being poured out, the more important factor is that tea can sort of get in the way and slow down the pour. I did this experiment with the same tea in each of these things. I bet you could probably make the case that certain teas will balk it more than other teas. We're not diving that deep in this episode, but you could definitely make that case for sure, sort of like how certain teas can clog teapots more than others can. I do think that this is the more practical scenario, brewing or measuring pour time with tea. So if you are measuring pour time of a gaiwan, it's important to do it with and without tea, in my opinion. Okay, so now we are moving on to teapots. So I used my usual array of teapots, many of which have been featured on TeaDB already. So I use most of these quite frequently. Most of my clay pots are around 100 milliliters, such as this one or this one. But I also use this big blue pot in a number of episodes that I think is around 250, 300 milliliters. This is quite large. Generally what I found is that the brew time for most of the vessels was between 10 and 17 seconds. Things like these pots poured around 10 seconds, whereas this big blue pot I think was the slowest one, pouring with 17 seconds. So again, this is with empty vessels. So it's the slowest pour, but there were a couple ones that were around 100 milliliters that were also kind of in that 14, 15 second range. So it's, kind of unsurprising. I think it is interesting that the two pots I do use for semi-aged pu'er and not more aged tea or traditionally stored tea pour the fastest. Probably not a total coincidence either. Things like semi-aged tea, you do need to worry about the bitterness for some teas, and you want to have a little bit more control over that. Whereas aged oolong or traditionally stored tea, I think you have a little bit more flexibility before the tea gets nasty. So a little bit more of a forgiving brew. Same thing with ripe, which is why I think this pot works just fine for ripe. Okay, so this was all without tea. But what about with tea? With tea, again, we could think of these two same scenarios. Basically, that tea could sort of infringe on the flow and slow it down, or that you're pouring in less water to start with, so it should theoretically pour out fast. I found in the case of these pots, these three specifically, I didn't measure the other two, but I anticipate the results would be the same, is that the actual pour was between 1.5 to 2 seconds more faster. So this is like the gaiwans, this is not a huge result, but it is the opposite result of gaiwans. And it's also kind of interesting, and I had not really thought of this, but it also makes a lot of sense. The rate of liquid that is coming out of these pots is really pretty much the same, assuming it does not get blocked or clogged. That's also an important factor. We'll talk about that a little bit in a second. So if you were to judge pure pour time, no tea in it, between a gaiwan and a pot, you could be looking at something like 2.5 seconds for something like that, this versus 10 seconds with something like that. So that's a pretty big difference. But in practicality, if we were to add tea into the equation, they would converge. So this same gaiwan would probably be pouring at something like 5 seconds, whereas this teapot might be brewing at, 8 seconds. So 5 versus 8 is a lot closer than 2 versus 10. So the difference in effective pour time is a lot closer. And again, this is something that probably won't impact your 2-minute or 3-minute long brews, but could have a pretty big impact if we were talking about a flash infusion or something that is like 4 or 5 seconds and you're just not waiting very long to brew, which I think is a pretty practical scenario for most of us. Okay, so practically speaking, a slower pouring pot is probably not a great match with something that needs to be brewed very quickly. So like a pot filled with yancha or a sheng pu'er prone to bitterness. So the same slow pouring pot is a lot easier to shrug off when the tea can be pushed. One final point that is that it's not really totally accurate to pretend like brewing with tea in a teapot cannot increase the pour time. So I think this goes into the clogging factor, which is a pretty big difference maker. For our experiments, we did not include the results where it was clogged. even partially, and so we're basically just measuring the ideal case scenario. So these clogs often vary in impact. You can have a clog that just a little bit slows it down, or you could have a clog that just totally halts the flow of liquid. In these experiments, in these trials, which I basically had to toss out, it could be anywhere from several seconds to double the steep time. And it's worth noting that this also occurs fairly often for a lot of pots, and I had to redo some trials. The real life scenario is that pots in practicality might brew a bit slower. You have to deal with the possibility of clogs. Something that I think is a lot less of a risk. Well, it's basically not a risk for things like gaiwans. The final experiment I did was a slight expansion of these tests. If you think about we haven't really captured the full steep time yet. The steep time really starts from the moment you pour from a kettle and it hits the tea. So while the pour time is interesting and, in my opinion, helpful to know a bit about, it doesn't really capture the full picture. And so the steep is really the moment the water hits the tea and the time it takes before you drain the water from the teapot into your cup or into your chahai. So I was interested in looking into the time right before pouring out your brewing vessel, but after, right before you brew out of your vessel, but after you poured hot water from your kettle into your device. So one thing I've done for the past couple of years that is related is pouring from the kettle with my left hand. I am right-handed, so this was not my natural inclination for handling hot water, but this way it frees up my right hand to steep. So I can pour from my left and then steep with my right. So in theory, that should be quicker if you want it to be. I'm not sure if that's the only factor playing into this, but it feels more natural, like you're using a balance of your body. So I was curious to do some experiments to see how big a difference this would make on the time to steep if you're using your left hand for your kettle or if you're using your right hand. So I enlisted my wife to help me measure the time it takes from the water leaving the kettle all the way to all the steeped water going from the brewing vessel into the chai. So we can use that measurement, subtract the difference between these measurements and the earlier ones with pour time to figure out what that difference is before you're actually pouring, but you are still steeping. It's kind of difficult to explain this without just a lot of verbiage, because I'm not sure. I'm sure there's some sort of technical Chinese term for what that's called, but I don't know it. So what I found was with pouring from the left hand to brewing it takes about 3 to 4 seconds. If you go right hand to right hand brewing, it takes about 1.5 to 2 seconds more. So it could be anywhere from 4.5 to 6 seconds, depending. So this is also a pretty small amount of time. Is it nothing? I don't think so, even if it is fairly subtle in the results. Again, this probably only really impacts flash brewing scenarios, but if your pour time is only 5 seconds and your handling time is 4 seconds, that 1.5 to 2 second difference between left hand and right hand brewing is still 15 to 20% of the overall steep time. And that's sheerly by the hand that you're using for the kettle. So another interesting thing to think about, in my opinion. So overall, probably a minor-ish impact. Is it worth thinking about? I think it could be, for sure. Okay, so some takeaways. I think these experiments are probably important for regular gongfu brewers. I think it's important when it comes to looking at your pots and choosing. I don't think it's all about, choosing X clay for X type of tea. I think pour time and things like that are pretty important factors, and they're also really easy factors to measure. So I think I do think I will be doing pour tests just to measure it. Really takes under a couple of minutes just to take out your phone and use the stopwatch feature to measure how long it takes to brew with or without tea. And it can really, I think, improve your intuition when it does come to brewing. So a couple quick hits is gaiwans can pour fastest, especially with no tea. They have a controllable pour and have the potential to generally just pour quicker. Pots pour quicker with tea, assuming no clogs. Bigger pots do generally seem to pour more slowly. I didn't test this with other pots, but I do think it is true. Practical pour time varies from 4.5 seconds to 15 seconds. A pretty significant difference if we're talking about the extremes of the cases. That's really a large difference if we think about the overall steep time. And so the actual steep time before time is at minimum 3 to 4 seconds if you pour the kettle with your left hand, and about 5 to 6 seconds with the right hand. And if we add those times together to sort of get our total steep time, your total steep time when doing a flash brew could be as little as 7.5 to 8 seconds, but it could also be longer than 20 seconds, a large and very significant difference. So I'd be curious to hear how everyone measures their own pots, and if someone has sort of an outlier pot that brews for 30 seconds or pours for 30 seconds, I would be curious to see how you use that pot. I would be hesitant to use anything that's that slow pouring. And I think it's often important to sometimes get back to these basics, recalibrate your own understanding of tea. So yeah, that concludes this episode. Again, feedback really appreciated for this. Any other ideas for experiments? I don't have anything in mind yet. Thank you all for tuning in, and I will see you all next time. Cheers.